the violence and all of this stuff, and the groupie scene too, which we haven't gotten to, and we haven't gotten to that part of Jimmy Page's wonderful character, is how he was with his women. And
I had a whole suitcase with like whips and stuff like that with him at all times.
Yeah. And the real thing that you hear from each of his women was that they all fell under his spell. He could be very charming. He could be very sweet. But he could also be a complete bastard. And by the time he was tired of you, he was off to the next one and you never heard, it's like all of a sudden, he's with someone else and you think you're seeing him that week and he's off with someone else already. So he was certainly not anything like monogamous, not that you'd expect that in that era or someone of his stature to be. But I mean, he just, the way he treated his women was very much misogynistic, even though they were all so into him. A lot of them complained about the same sort of this darkness that he had, this aura that he had that was, you get different stories from Pamela DeBars and Catherine James and Laurie Maddox, who was only 14 when she started, being Jimmy's girl. Laurie Maddox was a LA groupie who had lost her virginity to David Bowie even before she met Jimmy Page. She was like 13. She looked older, but I mean, Jimmy liked him young. Yeah. And Jimmy still likes him young. And Jimmy's girlfriend right now, Jimmy's now 74 or 5 or something like that. I don't know how old he's, something mid-70s. His girlfriend's 28. And, no harm, no foul. But I mean, in those days, he was doing a lot of things that you don't get away with anymore in the Me Too movement, and treating his women in ways that,
Kind of surprised that whole thing haven't come after the rock stars yet, because surely there's a lot there.
I think mostly it's because I agree with you. They're all fortunate because in those days it was an epic thing with the groupie scene. She talks about it now. And there was a great quote in that book we've been talking about where, she finally ran into Jimmy Page much later. And he was like, "Oh, Laurie, we were so young back then." And she said, "Well, I was." Jimmy Page was 33. She was 14. And he kept her locked up in a hotel room so that no one else would have her. He'd be out all day or out all night, and he'd come back and have his way with her. There was a lot of stories where, like, when he was in a good mood and treating them well, he treated them like queens and stuff. But people like Pamela DeBar and Catherine James were madly in love with him. And, part of that's the mystique, part of that's the rock star thing. But I mean, he could be very nice to them too. But, when he was done with him, he was done with him, and he was on to the next thing.
Yeah. Well, the whole groupie thing, that they kind of had their own little, like, groupie crew going, from what I understood.
Every town had them, but I mean, LA was the famous scene. Yeah. And the scene around the Hyatt House, the Continental Hyatt House, which when Zeppelin there, it was renamed the Riot House. They'd be coming and going all the time. And when Jimmy was really infatuated with someone, he'd make sure that he got that person. He'd pick them out of the crowd. He'd, have someone send for them. All he had to do was lift a finger, really, and he'd have what he wanted. And he could treat them, like I said, very well. He'd fly them over to England. He flew Catherine James over, and she lived with him for a little while, and then they flew her back. And when he was done with it, she was like, she actually had been like invited to stay, and he wanted to be with her. And then she realized she didn't really want that life, and her life was back in LA. But these other people like Pamela DeBar, she was the groupie who was really put it all in the first book about that. And she was with everybody from Page to Jagger to Keith Moon. She was with so many of them. Michael DeBars is the one she ended up marrying. There's this whole scene of groupies spread across certainly America, but probably everywhere. That in every town they knew, Sweet Connie in Arkansas and all that, all of those people were part of those scenes. But I mean, Jimmy had his own specific women that he was with, and then he had, he did marry some people. He wasn't faithful to them, but I can't speak to how any woman who's married to someone in Led Zeppelin or a band of that stature expects the husband to be monogamous out on the road in that era. Robert Plant wasn't either. Robert Plant usually comes off smelling like a rose compared to everybody else, but he had a wife and kids at home, and he wasn't being faithful either. So, but he wasn't dark and malevolent like Page was.
Yeah, he always seems like a friendly, soft-natured guy.
Well, he's a big old hippie.
Yeah, exactly.
At heart, yeah.